Hey, welcome everybody. So last time we looked at e6 for black, which is the move that I like, but now we're going to take a look at e5 for black, which is more popular among top levels, and we've been seeing many games in it. So first of all, I'd like to get a couple sidelines down. Knight f3 has been played a few times, just trying to take control of this d5 square and stopping bishop e6, because if bishop e6 here, knight g5 is very strong. But I don't really believe in this move after something like bishop e7, like bishop c4, castles, knight bd7. I just don't think white's going to have too much here. It's been played a few times, but I think black should be doing okay. So, what we're mainly going to look at is knight b3 here, which is the real main move. So there's a few different move orders black can play here. He can play bishop e6 or bishop e7, but I think those are the two main moves. So if bishop e6, f3, bishop e7, queen d2, castles, knight bd7, we're getting towards the mainline stuff. So, but first I'd like to take a look at a couple little things. Like bishop e6, while it's played the most commonly, I actually don't think is the most accurate, because now white plays queen d2. And after bishop e7, f4, I think white actually has some good play. Knight g4, f5 seems like this is an interesting position, but it's very double-edged, because white can't castle right away, because bishop g5 is hanging over his head. That being said, I like this knight on d5. I like white's light-squared bishop. I think white probably has some advantage here. So black will probably play something like e takes f4, bishop takes f4, castles, knight c6. But after bishop takes d6, I think that, I mean, this pawn is always weak, but I don't think black is going to get quite enough for the pawn. For example, maybe bishop takes b3, c takes b3 is very important. We don't want black playing queen a5 to a1 after a takes. And then something like takes here. After something like bishop c4, for example, I think even if black ends up taking this pawn, white's going to have good play and excellent pressure along this diagonal, and this bishop is very strong. So, and after f4, that's obviously not the end of the story. There's lots of things that can happen. Queen c7 is quite popular, and then f5, bishop c4, positions like this. Black can do this after playing b5 first too, but I'm not as much of a believer in it this way, like b5, f5, bishop c4. I think white should definitely be a bit better here. You know, he'll quickly play b3, he'll put this knight on e2, and this d5 square is weak. Another kind of comical line here is knight bd7, which is maybe more accurate than bishop e7, because now f4, rook c8, it's actually hard for white to play f5, because if f5 here, bishop takes b3 is surprisingly very strong. This just looks bad because we're getting rid of this bishop for this junk knight, and white's going to play bishop c4. But black actually has this nice counterstrike, d5, opening up this bishop and letting his pieces into the game. Something like e takes d5, bishop b4. This pawn is not going to stay forever, and I think black will have a good game. For example, something like this, knight c5, which threatens knight e4, threatens knight d5, threatens queen d5. Black just seems to have a good position. So knight takes d5 is the critical test, but now knight takes e4, and this queen has no real good square. So queen e2 is the best move, now queen h4 check, and white should play g3, knight takes g3, h takes g3, queen takes h1, castle queenside. And white's got some attack, but I think if black knows what he's doing here, queen e4, for example, black should be okay, and I don't think white's going to have too much here. So after rook c8, castles queenside is probably the best move. And again, we get to sharp, interesting positions. Maybe something like this could be played. And one other thing that I've looked at is after bishop e takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight e5. castles queenside, bishop e7, knight d4, castles. I don't think knight takes e6 is very strong because now these squares are covered very well. This bishop might be awkward after something like knight g4. If black can trade up this bishop, he's in good shape. And this position, while black has doubled isolated pawns, he's just got a lot of control of good squares, like bishop c5 to d4 might happen. This queen's well placed, or the queen will be well placed on b6, for example. I think that black's doing just fine here. So, for example, something like queen e3, queen c7. Black's got great compensation. He's not even down a pawn really, although long term he will be. I mean, moves like knight g4 coming in, so maybe like bishop e2, but then bishop c5 to d4. Black's got to have excellent compensation for this slight weakness here. I think black's just better. So, but the main move here is knight f5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and now queen c8, hitting this pawn. This is Topolov's move, queen c8. But and if white plays something like bishop d3, I think black should probably be okay after something like this, just freeing his pieces. Something like knight d5, queen d5, rook d8. I think black should be doing okay. But I like actually just giving black this pawn after h3. Queen takes f5, g4. And now white has a very simple plan. He plays bishop g2, covering all of these nice squares and hitting this pawn on b7. And after white plays g5, the knight can come into d5, and white will have a huge attack. And black's got this spectator bishop that's doing nothing. And I think white easily has enough compensation for the pawn and is probably a little bit better. So for this reason, I think it's better to play bishop e7 first, because after bishop e7, queen d2, castle, I don't think f4 is as effective now that this bishop isn't going to be hit on e6. For example, say knight b7 here, and now b5, and black's threatening b4, winning this pawn, and then bishop b7 is going to come. Black's going to have good pressure. So after bishop e7, white plays f3, and here black plays bishop e6, queen d2. The point is, if black castles, white can play g4 right away and make some problems. But after queen d2, after bishop e6, if white plays g4 here, black plays this nice counterthrust, d5. So if g5, d4, g takes f6, bishop takes f6, white's getting his pieces forked here. I think black's totally fine. White would like to do something like this, but it's going to run into some checks. And I think black's doing great here. In fact, in this position, this is actually just going to be checkmate. But, and then f4 is forced and queen takes mate. So, but in general, I think that white can't get away with playing g4 right away. So white plays queen d2, castles, castles. And now there's a big parting in the roads here. The main line is knight bd7, but there's many other variations. b5 is possible, queen c7 is possible, for example. So queen c7, I think, is actually quite poisonous. So the point is, if white plays white plays g4, oftentimes black will, so something like this, g5, black will actually come to h5 and try to get this knight to f4. And it's hard for white to get an attack going with like h4 because this knight just blockades everything. But actually after g4, I think rook c8 is objectively best, because now after g5 here, knight d5, white can't take back with the queen because queen takes c2 is checkmate. And one important thing is, in this position, if white plays something like king b1, which is a natural move, I think d5 is very strong for black. And if g5, again, d4 is strong. And if e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5. This looks good for white because queen takes d2 doesn't work. But black just plays rook d8 here, and white's lost because this rook is going to fall. So after rook c8, white basically has to play g5. but then king b1, and it's just a very interesting position with chances for both sides. I think a5 is commonly a plan for black trying to play a4 and a3 and undermine the defense of this knight. And white can play a4, for example, but now knight c6 and knight b4 will come in, and maybe d5 will follow. And after a5, I think knight d5 is a fine move too, for example. So, but that's kind of a sideline. It's not played as much. The main line here runs knight bd7. That's what we're really going to be focusing our attention on. So, g4, b5, g5, b4. So this is a really sharp line. If white can try g takes f6 here, which has actually recently been tried by Evgeny Nair, but I think in this position, black should be okay. White's real point is to try to make use of this weak c6 square, but after something like queen d7, if knight c6, rook c8, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, black's already just fine. He's going to play d5, and white's going to have some problems on these b and c files. But instead, white can play queen c6, and then rook c8, queen takes d7, bishop takes d7. Now knight b7. This is actually a really funny position after rook c6. White just plays something like bishop e2, and black's completely paralyzed. He has no way of kicking this knight away. No good way. If bishop c8, this is not a move he wants to play. White will probably do something like this, bring his knight to c4. And if rook b8, then knight a5 forces black to abandon defense of this a6 pawn. And obviously, rook c7 won't work because the knight takes d6. So I think that it's this is interesting, but I think if black handles it well, maybe bishop c8 is best there. I don't think that there's too much for black to worry about. So knight d5 is a possible move, but again, I don't think too much of this move either. After knight takes, e takes, bishop f5. This bishop is well placed. And if white could quickly play bishop d3, bishop takes, queen takes, and then play knight d2, I think white would be doing great. But as it is, white can't, because after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, black has bishop takes g5. I should mention the same follows on queen takes b4. Bishop takes g5. I think black's doing very well. So there's moves like king b1 here and then a5. I think black's doing good. He's going to have some attack. So here, knight ce2, knight e8. So this is another point where there's a crossing in the roads. h4 is a reasonable move. It's been played a few times. f4 is the main line. So, for example, h4, a5, just trying to kick this knight away with a4. King b1, a4, knight c1, just to make room. Now, b3 is very tempting for black with trying to get an attack going. For example, if white plays the straightforward ab3, cb3, ab3, a3, which is typical, trying to hold this, I think black has this nice move d5, which I actually saw my friend Nicholas Yap play once very successfully. White can't take this because of bishop f5 check with some devastating consequences after something like maybe bishop takes a3 here, for example. So, and if white plays something like, and obviously knight c3, d4 is no good. And so something like knight g3, there's maybe knight b6, trying to hop into c4, protecting this pawn here. I think black's doing quite well. And f4, and I think here knight d6 is very strong, and the game was over quite quickly. So, but after b3, what is this nice move? Knight c3, which I think is very strong because it's asking black what he wants to do. If b takes c2, queen takes c2, is this really so great for black? You know, where's black's attack? Meanwhile, white's just going to play knight d5. And if b takes a2, knight takes a2, knight will come to b4, and then more pressure on this d5 square. So after an end, if black really just cares nothing about but opening a file, then he can try this, but I'm just not a believer. I think white's going to be fine here. This pawn cover is pretty solid. This pawn is defended this pawn on a2 is defended very well by our two knights, and I don't think black's going to have too much play here. So here, black should play knight b6, which is a move Anand has played a few times. So knight g3 is the main move, covering knight c4 by the bishop. And if knight c4, bishop takes, knight f5, white's starting to attack too. And it's also hard for black to untangle his pieces, because if this knight ever moves, white will play knight takes e7, queen takes e7, and queen takes d6. So this is all very topical, very long variations. I think, if memory serves, queen b8 is the move that black usually plays here, but I'm not sure exactly because I haven't been playing this for either side, because the main thing white should be playing here actually is f4, which is the main line. So a5, f5. And there's a few interesting moves here, like bishop takes b3 has actually recently become popular, and I think it's quite strong. So c takes b3, a4 is very strong is the point. If a takes b3, a4 seems absolutely devastating with this king being where it is. So c takes b3, a4 I think takes, rook takes, and b3 is the best way to play. There's actually a comical line after king b1. I think rook takes a2 is actually quite interesting. King takes a2, queen a8 check, and hitting this pawn. So if white plays king b1, queen takes e4 check, this rook is hanging at bare minimum, gets his material back. So king b3, and now bishop takes g5. And if bishop takes g5 for white, then knight c5 check seems to win after something like king takes b4, queen f4 check, and knight takes e4 wins the queen. So I think after bishop takes g5, black's doing quite well. So for this reason, I think b3 is the best move. But after a move like rook a5, for example, followed it up by queen a8, black's going to have some decent play. And I think it's approximately equal chances. I mean, it's not equal like a draw, but I think, in this kind of position, often the better player will be the one who wins the game. So a4 is the main line. And now there's some interesting variations. F takes e6 has recently become a little bit popular after a takes b3, e takes f7 check, rook takes f7, king b1. The point is, after b takes a2, king a1, black has this nice pawn here, but his attack isn't doing much, and if white gets a couple tempi to play knight g3, bishop c4, he's going to be very happy. So it's a very interesting position. I think there's a few ways to play this. Oh yeah, and I should also point out, if rook takes a2, knight c1 is very strong. And queen a8, knight takes b3, everything is just held together, and bishop c4 is going to happen. And if b takes c2, queen takes c2, this rook is attacked, and again, bishop c4 is going to come with nice effect. So b takes c2 is also a move. And now if queen takes c2, then bishop takes g5, black should be pretty happy because he's trading off this worst piece, or at least improving it, and costing white some time. So king takes c2, and now knight b6. Just trying to hold down this square. I should mention, if rook takes a2, again, knight c1 followed by bishop c4 is good for white. So b takes c2, king takes c2, knight b6, knight g3, and I think d5 is actually a strong, knight c1. Holding this pawn and looking this up. I think d5 is actually quite strong here, and then knight d6. It's actually awkward for white to deal with this threat of knight c4. So, for example, something like b3 is probably going to run into some sort of queen c7 check, queen c8 check, and maybe bring this rook to c7 someday, and white's going to be under some serious pressure. And if king b1, for example, then knight c4, bishop takes, knight takes, queen e2, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, bishop takes g5, and black's got to be fine. This king is very weak. a2 is going to be under pressure. Once this knight gets traded off, it's going to be hard for white to defend it. Alternatively, I think g6 is actually the best move for white here, trying to at least make some weaknesses in black's camp. But again, I think black should be just fine. So the main move here actually is knight bd4, which looks a little silly, but the point is after knight takes d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, this bishop is still hit. And if bishop takes a2, knight c6 is very strong, hitting the queen and hitting the bishop. So here the main move for black is b3, and if b takes a2, black makes a new queen. So what white does here is king b1, and if b takes a2, king a1, white's got to be very happy with his position, because black's pawn on a2 serves as a great defender for him, actually, and it's hard for black to make an attack happen. Meanwhile, his pieces are horrible. White's going to get his piece back right away in this extremely important bishop on e6. So here what black does is b takes c2 check. So if queen takes c2, I think rook c8 is good, followed it up by bishop c4 to get his pieces out. For example, queen takes a4, bishop c4, and if bishop takes knight b6, black gets his piece back. And we'll be up a piece. So here knight takes c2 is the move, and now bishop b3, very nice. A takes b3, a takes b3, and now black's got this devastating open a file. So knight a3, white must block it, and now knight e5, threatening knight f3 and winning this pawn. So often white will play something like h4, and then there's rook a5, there's rook a4. There's a lot of interesting tries here. I think actually the best move in either case is rook h3, with the idea of moving this bishop away and swinging this rook over to the defense of the king by taking this pawn on b3. And I think white might have a slight edge in some of those positions. For example, if queen a8 here, queen d5 I think is very strong for white. And if rook takes c4, queen g2, for example, just trying to throw f6 through also, like rook g4, because otherwise if rook comes back to a4, for example, f6, and after takes, we have a discovered check, and we're going to win a piece. So after rook g4, queen b7, and white's going to take this pawn off. It's interesting, but I think white should, on the whole, probably be pretty happy with this position. So that is some of the mainline stuff. And I think, is there anything else here to look at? I should also point out that there's a lot of not so forcing lines in these positions where after g5, it's in black's best interest to play knight h5 and try to sink it into f4 if white ever plays like knight g3. And then oftentimes, like, for example, let's just play a couple silly moves. If knight e2, g6, knight g3, knight f4, oftentimes this is okay. Or okay, let's play h4 first for white so that bishop takes g5 won't be a problem. Like, this obviously isn't actually about opening, it's just sort of about an idea. Is often this pawn sacrifice is okay because this bishop will be an excellent defender. Something like h5, bishop g7, takes, white's not giving checkmate, this bishop's attacking, and I think black's doing okay. But again, that's not an opening variation, but a key idea to know that knight h5 is always something that you should be looking for. You don't know exactly where you want to put your knight. And in this case here, after g5, b4, knight e2, it is in fact e8, but in a lot of cases, like we saw earlier in the line where black plays queen c7 here, g4, rook c8, g5, here knight h5 is the best move. So again, this bishop e3 line, both in the e6 variation and the e5 variation, they're very interesting variations, and I would encourage further home study. Thanks.